To the southeast of Mga, among forests and swamps, lies the small railway halt of Pogostye. A few small houses on the bank of a river, black from peat shrubs, thickets of birch and alder, and endless swamps. Passengers and passing trains don't even think to look out the windows they pass through this godforsaken place. It was unknown before the war, and remains unknown now. However, one of the bloodiest battles of the Leningrad front took place here. In the military diary of the Chief of Staff of the German Army, this place is constantly mentioned from December 1941 to May 1942, and even later until January 1944. It is referred to as a hot spot where a dangerous military situation developed. The reason is that Pogostye was the starting point for an attempt to lift the siege of Leningrad. This is where a so-called Luban operation began. Our troops, the 54th Army, was supposed to break through the front, advance to Luban station on the Leningrad-Moscow railway, and join there with the 2nd Shock Army, which was advancing from Mysnoy Bor on Volkhov. This operation was part of a larger strategic plan to break the blockade of Leningrad, which had been under siege since September 1941. The plan was to split and destroy the German forces surrounding Leningrad, subsequently lifting the blockade. The outcome of the strategy is well known. The 2nd Shock Army was encircled and partially destroyed, with the remainder captured along with its commander, General Vlasov. Meanwhile, the 54th Army, after the 3 months of brutal fighting that drenched Pogostye and its surroundings in blood, managed to advance only about 20 kilometers. Its regiments almost reached Luban, but once again, losing almost their entire personnel, became stuck for a long time in the wild forests and swamps. Now this operation has been forgotten. Even General Fedyuninsky, who commanded the 54th Army at that time, modestly omits it in his memoirs, though he did mention that it was the most difficult, the hardest time in his military career. We arrived near Pogostye in early January 1942, early in the morning. A blanket of snow spread over the swamps, stunted trees rose from the snowdrifts. Along the road, here and there, fresh graves were visible, mounds with wooden posts at the head. In the grey twilight, frosty fog swirled. The temperature was about 30 degrees below zero. Not far away, there was rumbling and booming, and stray bullets flew past us. All around, numerous vehicles, some boxes and various equipment were visible, poorly camouflaged with branches. Scattered groups of soldiers and individual, hunched figures slowly crawled in different directions. A wounded soldier told us that our latest attack on Pogostye had failed, and that the German firing positions dug into the railway embankment were sweeping away all living things with a barrage of machine gun fire. Artillery and mortars were intensively shelling the approaches to the station. It was impossible to raise one's head. He also informed us that our forces had supposedly taken Pogostye station on the run in late December, when they first approached this area. However, there was a supply of alcohol in the station buildings, and the drunken heroes was slaughtered by the Germans who arrived in time. Since then, all attempts to break through have ended in failure. A typical story. How many times later did I hear it at different times and on various sections of the front? Meanwhile, our guns took up positions and opened fire. We started to settle in the forest. We managed to break the frozen ground only to a depth of 40 to 50 centimeters. Below that was water, so our shelters turned out to be shallow. One could crawl into them through a special entrance covered with a tarp and could only lie down inside. But in the depths, A small stove made from an old bucket was burning, creating a damp, sauna-like warmth. The fire turned snow into water and water into steam. After about 3 days, everything dried out and became quite cozy. In any case, we slept in warmth, and this was a great happiness. Sometimes we burned telephone cable for lighting in the dugout. It burned with a foul, resinous flame, spreading stench and soot that settled on our faces. In the mornings, crawling out of their holes, soldiers would cough and blow out black, tarry clots of soot onto the white snow. I remember how one morning I stuck my swollen, dirty face out of the dugout. After the impenetrable darkness, the sun's rays were blinding, and I blinked for a long time looking around. It turned out that a surgeon standing nearby had been observing me. He remarked with a smirk, "I can't tell if you're crawling out face first or ass first." And yet, life in the dugouts near Pogostye was a luxury and privilege, as most soldiers, especially infantrymen, slept right on the snow. A fire couldn't always be lit due to aviation, and many people got frostbite on their noses, fingers and toes, and sometimes froze completely. The soldiers looked terrible, blackened with red inflamed eyes, in burned greatcoats and felt boots. It was especially difficult to protect the wounded from the frost. They were usually dragged through the snow on special light wooden boats, and to keep them warm, they were covered with chemical heaters. These were small green canvas cushions. You had to pour a little water inside, after which a chemical reaction occurred, releasing heat that lasted for 2-3 hours. Sometimes the sleds were pulled by dogs, kind, intelligent creatures. Usually the medic would release the lead dog of the team under fire into no man's land, where a person couldn't get through. The dog would find the wounded, return, and crawl back there again with the whole team. The dogs managed to pull the sled to the healthy side of the wounded, help him roll into the boat, and crawl out of the danger zone. The fate of severely wounded was harsh. Most often it was impossible to pull them out from under fire at all. But even for those who were carried out of no man's land, the suffering did not end. The journey to the medical unit was long, and to the hospital it took many hours. Upon reaching the hospital tents, one had to wait, as the doctors, despite their selfless, round-the-clock work for many weeks, could not manage to treat everyone. A long queue of bloody stretchers with people groaning, tossing in fever, or frozen in shock waited for them. Those wounded in the abdomen could not withstand such a weight. Many others died as well. However, in subsequent years, the situation improved significantly. As I learned later, the situation of the wounded in the winter of 1942 was even worse in some other sections of the Soviet German front. A neighbor in the hospital bed told me about one episode. In 1941, our division was sent to Murmansk to reinforce the units defending there. We moved on foot across the tundra to the west. Soon the division came under fire, and a snowstorm began. Wounded in the arm, not having reached the front line, I turned back. The wind strengthened. The blizzard howled. The snow whirl knocked me off my feet. Having struggled through several kilometers exhausted, I reached a dugout where there was a warming point. It was almost impossible to enter. The wounded stood close together, pressed against each other, filling their entire space. Still, I managed to squeeze inside, where I slept standing up until morning. In the morning, a shout came from outside. "Is anyone alive? Come out!" It was the medics arriving. 3 or 4 people crawled out of the dugout. The rest had frozen to death. And near the entrance, there was a stack of snow-covered corpses piled up. These were the wounded brought from the front line to the warming point during the night and frozen here. As it turned out, almost the entire division froze that night on the wind-exposed mountain roads. The blizzard was very strong. I got up with just frostbitten face and fingers. Meanwhile, at our location near Pogostye, about half a kilometer from the front line, it was becoming more crowded. A whole city formed in the birch grove. Tents, dugouts, huts, headquarters, warehouses, kitchens. All of this was smoking, swarming with bustling people, and the German spotter plane nicknamed Kocherga, poker, due to its crooked outline, quickly discovered us. The shelling began sparse but almost constant for many days, sometimes intensifying, sometimes weakening. People got used to it, although there were several killed and wounded daily. But what was this compared to the hundreds dying on the front line? Here I parted with a fellow serviceman who had come with me from the Leningrad radio school. It was someone named Nilov. A shrapnel fragment had pierced his throat, seemingly without damaging vital centers. He could even speak in a whisper. After bandaging his throat, I took him in a passing vehicle to the medical unit located about 5 kilometers away from us in tents. I observed strange, bizarre scenes on the frontline road. Busy as a boulevard, it had two-way traffic. Reinforcements, weapons, tanks, and food were going in one direction. In the opposite direction, they were dragging the wounded. Along the roadsides, there was a bustle. Here, spreading a tarp on the snow, they're dividing bread. But it's impossible to cut, so the soldiers are sawing the frozen loaf with a two-handed saw. They divide pieces and the sawdust into equal parts. The division is done fairly. Such bread needs to be sucked like a lollipop until it thaws. The cold was terrible. Soup froze in the pot, and the spit, not reaching the ground, turned into an icicle and clanked loudly on the hard earth. Here they're burying a dead man in the snow, a wounded soldier who didn't make it to the hospital, who either froze or bled to death. Here they're bargaining, exchanging vodka for bread. Here a cook is making gruel, stirring in a cauldron with a huge spoon. Steam is billowing, and under the cauldron the fire crackles merrily. At the edge of the forest I came across empty spruce huts. Around them were scattered dozens of black naval jackets, sailor caps with ribbons, and many stylish black ankle boots. Yesterday, they were changing naval infantrymen who came from Leningrad into warm army clothes. The sailors left, never to return, and their stuff no longer needed by anyone is being covered by sparse snow. Further on, they're giving out white bread from a truck. How I want to eat. A detachment of quote-unquote political fighters has arrived. They're being fed before another attack. The command has high hopes for them, but they also had high hopes for the naval infantry. By the road stand carts and gun limbers. The guns themselves and their personnel have gone into battle. The stuff obviously doesn't belong to anyone anymore, and nimble rear echelon soldiers are rummaging through this train in search of food. I still lack the front line hardening for such an operation. Again, they're burning someone, and again, the wounded are trudging along. From a truck, an automatic anti-aircraft gun is definitely pounding at the plane. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta! But all misses. Suddenly, a series of shell explosions. Further away, closer, nearby, on the ground, a sentry who stood by the headquarters dugout writhes in blood. An elderly soldier walking on the road clutches his leg. Next to him is a young girl, a medical instructor. She's bawling her eyes out, streams of tears running down her dirty, unwashed for many days face. Her hands are shaking. She's lost her composure. A pitiful sight. The soldier calmly takes off his pants, bandages the bleeding hole on his thigh, and still finds the strength to comfort and reassure the girl. "Daughter, don't be afraid, don't cry." War is not women's business. There is no argument there were many heroines who could be set as examples for men, but it's too cruel to make women endure the torments of the front. And if only that, it was hard for them to be surrounded by men. The hungry soldiers, true, had no time for women. But the superiors got their way by any means, from rough pressure to the most exquisite courtship. Among the many suitors were daredevils for every taste, to sing, to dance, to speak eloquently, and for the educated ones to read Bloch or Lermontov. And the girls went home with additions to their families. It seems this was called, in the language of military officers, living under Order 009. In our unit, out of 50 who arrived in 1942, only 2 soldiers of the fair sex remained by the end of the war. But living under Order 009 was the best outcome. It could be worse. I was told how a certain Colonel Volkov would line up the female reinforcements and, walking along the line, would pick out the beautiest he fancied. These would become his field wives, and if they resisted, to the guardhouse, to a cold dugout, on bread and water. Then the little one would be passed around, going to various assistants and deputies in the best Asian traditions.